Arthur Bernard Bisguier was born in New York, October 8, 1929. He became an international master in 1950 and a grandmaster in 1957. He was United States chess champion in 1954. He won the U.S. Open in 1950-56, also in 1959. He won the Manhattan Chess Championship in 48-49, 57-58, 58-59, 67-60, 68-69. He finished first place, tied with Tartakover at Southsea in 1950, first place at Vienna 52-53, first place at Rosenwald 55-56, and first place at Lone Pine in 1973. Toward the end of his life, Bisguier was the world's oldest active grandmaster, his last tournament being the MCC Memorial Swiss in, is it Natick, Massachusetts, or Natick, Massachusetts? I'm not sure of the pronunciation. That was September 2014. He passed away April 5th, 2017 at the age of 87. We've got the eval bar turned on and we have the annotator turned on, but we are going to leave the analysis bot off. We'll leave that in the off position so as not to bias our own observations. This game begins with pawn e4, pawn e5, knight f3, knight f6. Petrov's defense, named for the Russian Alexander Petrov. Knight takes the E-man is the classical variation. Pawn d6 hits the knight and chases it back. Knight f3. Knight takes white's E-man. Queen e2, pinning the knight to the king. This is Cozio's attack, the attack that I play, named for Carlo Cozio. And you're familiar with the name Cozio if you're familiar with Cozio's defense in the Spanish game. He's more famous for that than for this. Carlo Cozio, Count of Montiglio and Salabue, is that how it's pronounced? He lived from 1715 to 1780. An Italian chess player and theorist, best remembered for his book Il Gioco degli Scacchi. So after queen e2, pinning the knight, the pin is broken with queen e7. Pawn d3 repels the knight back to f6. Bishop g5. Queen takes queen check. Bishop takes queen. Bishop e7, knight c3, bishop d7, not the book move. The bot recommending h6. However, the book move, let's go back a move. The book move is c6, queenside castles, knight a6, and rook h to e1, knight to c7. The normal continuation in Cozio's attack. Come back. In this game, bishop d7 by Bisguier. Bobby kingside castles anyway, and knight c6. Pawn d4, pawn h6, kicking the bishop away. Bobby chose bishop h4. The bot recommending bishop e3. I would suggest that bishop f4 and bishop takes knight are also perfectly valid. Let's see, bishop f4. That gets a thumbs up, and as mentioned, bishop takes knight is also perfectly valid. Ironically, when I played bishop f4, it said I should have played bishop takes knight. When I play bishop takes knight, it says I should have played bishop f4. We've seen this nonsense from Ficklebot before, and we're going to see it again. That's what we do. We see these things. Of course, here bishop takes bishop would be played, but you can now play knight d5, putting some questions out there. In this game, Bobby played bishop h4, and Bisguier queenside castles. Right g5 is recommended by the bot, attacking the bishop, force him back to g3. And then if you like, you can make him decide where he's going to put his knight. And there are precious few squares. You can go h4, e1, or g1 are the basic moves. I suppose d2 as well, but do you want to put it back to bed? Doesn't have much of a future here on h4, but it's probably not a bad move. I get a thumbs up. G1, star, and e1. And no response. I don't know why the bot's not answering here. The one problem with d2 is, of course, you're undefending this pawn. So probably not d2. So anyway, that wasn't played. Instead, queenside castles, bishop c4, rook df8. And by the way, I would think g5 can be played here as well. Yeah, I get a star. Rook d e1. Wait a moment. I skipped the move. Oh, rook d f8. Rook d e1. Bishop d8. d5 hits the knight. Knight back to bed. Knight e7 apparently the better choice. Knight d4. Rook e8. Knight db5. Attacking this pawn. So for some reason, the bot didn't like that move. It wanted f3. That's to vacate f2 and bring your bishop here to f2. Knight db5 was played, threatening the a-man here. It's checkmate, right? Knight a7 is checkmate. Please attack my knight. Checkmate. A smothered checkmate, no less. So, bishop takes the knight. Bishop takes the bishop. I'd be tempted to take with the other knight. It does get a star. What does knight takes get? I guess it is more complex, isn't it? So we threaten the a-man, but it is somewhat complex, isn't it? So a6 can now be played because this square is available to the king. You give check, pretty risky, but the king is contained and boxed in by his own pieces. All we have to do is play our bishop to f5, and that would be winning. If only bishops moved like that. Bishop takes the bishop, gets the star. Rook takes rook, check. Right, knight b d7 being called for here. It's a little wilder because maybe bishop takes knight, bishop takes bishop. Let's see what I get. Bishop takes bishop and knight e4, all getting stars. He could play bishop e5 for safety here. Check market likes bishop g5 check better. Back, back, back. Instead, rook takes rook check, rook takes the rook, knight takes the pawn on d5. The point here is after takes, there's a fork. Plus, you're compelled to do something about your undefended bishop. So, Bobby goes ahead and takes the knight and says, please take my bishop. Knight takes knight, bishop takes bishop is played. g3 hits the bishop, bishop g5 check. Now f4 hits the bishop again. c6 says, I've had enough. I'm going to play my fork. So pawn takes the bishop on g5. Pawn takes the pawn, says, I can take one of the two pieces later. The fork is still in place. And I've unleashed my rook. So rook e7, coming for the c7 square with check. So pawn takes the knight, removing the defender of c7. In that case, I'll play rook takes f7. Greyhound wants to consider the check here. Right, well, what we'll do is we'll attack the knight, and then if you save your bishop, we'll pin the knight. Say you play bishop d3, for example. Just for example, the rook's coming over. I know that moving the knight is better. I'm saying say if. But that was not played. Rook e7 was played. Pawn takes knight, rook takes the f-man. Rook takes the h-man, rook takes the g-man. Both parties doing some bloodletting here. So we're already rook-bishop versus rook-knight, aren't we? Knight c6 is played. Rook takes the g-man, knight e5. Now that's a big threat because check is coming, and that would force the king to the d2 square. As you can see, that would make the king and rook susceptible to a fork. So a big threat right there with knight e5. So rook g7 moves the rook away from the target square. Rook g2, bishop d3, knight c4, hoping to undouble his pawns, and Bobby accommodates him. Goes to a rook versus rook endgame. Bishop takes knight, pawn takes the bishop. a4, d5. Should be a draw. c3, rook g1 check, king d2, rook g2 check, king c1, rook g1 check, and Bobby content for a draw, it feels like, but he says, I'm not going to allow the repetition. I'll play king c2. After king c2, rook a1, rook g5, rook takes the pawn on a4, rook takes the pawn on d5. White has a passed pawn, but as you can see, the eval bar is dead equal. It won't be difficult for this rook to get behind the passed pawn. Rooks belong behind passed pawns. King c7 is played here. Pawn g4, king c6, rook d2. Don't let him get behind your passed pawn. Oh, you can come up here. Okay, you should be okay. But you'd rather be behind the passed pawn. In fact, he does play to rook a5, king d1, rook d5. King e2, rook takes the rook. He says, I am in the square of the pawn and I'll be able to stay there. King takes the rook. This should be a dead draw. The king is in the square of this pawn, so the pawn cannot promote, cannot make it unabated to the goal line here. King d5, king e3, king e5. King f3, pawn a5, king e3. g5 is coming soon to decoy the king away from the d4 square so that we can take d4. a4, and sure enough, g5. King f5, king d4, king takes g5, king takes c4. Now, it might seem like this guy's really far away, but so is this guy. So by the time our king collects this guy and works his way up to b7, this king will be able to make his way in to stop our pawns. Should be able to. In fact, king f4 begins the journey. King b4. Now, the bot says king b5. King b5 is going to be answered by king e3. And then what? King b6 or takes, either or. You can king, yeah, that's a star, or you could just take. Then he's got king d2, and that should be sufficient as well. Bobby with king b4, king e3, king takes a4, king d2, king b3. You can also play king a3. But here king b3 was played, king d3, pawn c4, king d2, king a4, wanting to get king b5 played, king c2, king a3, king d3. And that is marked inaccurate, but it does not matter. Note the eval bar says it's still dead equal. But I think the point is here you allow white to grab the opposition, king b3. Now, we're on move number 55, which means the time is ticking. I'm sure it was 40 in 2 and 20 in the following hour. So they have to make it to move 60 to satisfy the time control, because this is one of the most basic endgames out there, and a master of Bisguier's caliber should not have blown this. The principle is this: you do not move your pawn because you want to force his king to take 4 turns to capture it. Inexplicably, Bisguier pushed his pawn, and there goes the game. He had an impeccable game until. It's the first and only mistake of the game. There were a couple of inaccuracies. As we scroll back up, look at that. There was just 2 inaccuracies, one on Fischer's part and one on Bisguier's part, and that inaccuracy is debatable. Didn't matter whether he played king d3 or king d2. So really only one mistake in the game, and it cost him the game. What a shame. What a shame indeed. Let's go back. And this is something you need to know, because this will happen in your end games, in your own games. You don't want to help your opponent by moving your targets closer to his attacker, and his king is his attacker. Keep in mind, you've got to eliminate 2 pawns. He only has to eliminate 1. And so instead of b6, what should be played here? King d2. And after king b4, king c2. And if he doesn't come back and defend, if he does come back and defend, you just repeat. Doink, doink, doink. If he doesn't come back and defend, let's suppose that he says, well, I'm going to go after your pawn. And this is why b6 is losing. If the pawn's here, I'm already attacking it. But it's not here. It's on b7. So after king takes pawn, c5, king b3, king b6, king b4. You can't move your pawn without me being able to take it, and you can't take my pawn without me being able to take yours. Either way, it's a draw. So there you go. You could also start with the pawn here. It doesn't matter. It's the same thing. It's just different. Okay. So b6 is a losing blunder because you're helping your opponent capture your pawn by moving it closer to the attacker. The rest of the game is easily winning. King b4, king c2. Bobby goes ahead and plays king a3. Not sure why. It gets an exclam, though. Oh, because his pawn's still too close. Ah, that's clever. Yeah, if you play here, because now here, and you're not out front. Yeah, okay. I blundered on that one. So, king a3, king d3, king b3, king d2, and that one little move. King a4, king c2, pawn b4. Wow. And Black resigned. Now, get a load of these numbers. Let's go to the review tab. 98.9 accuracy for Bobby Fischer. 95.6. 95.6 accuracy for Bisguier. It should be a success. One lousy blunder is all it took. And that's all it ever takes. One lousy blunder. And the bot only called it a mistake, but it was a blunder. If you go from drawn to losing, that's a blunder. I'm not real clear on how the bot determines the difference between a mistake and a blunder. But obviously, if you go from dead drawn to completely losing, it's a blunder. Look at the ratings there. Bobby's individual single game rating assessment, 2950. 2950. Take that, modern grandmasters. And they both had amazing openings and middle games. Even the end games were pretty good up until B6 was played. So poor Arthur Bisguier. And Bobby starts the tournament out with a point in his pocket. I think the clock must have been a factor. It must have been.